Hi, everybody. Uh, Thank you for joining us here today for the first call in the High Holidays Inclusion Learning Series. This is following up. This is the second URJ-Ruderman Inclusion Learning Series that we've done, following up on the Mental Health Learning Series. All of the information about that series is available on disabilitiesinclusion.org in the mental health section, and we hope that you'll check that out. Today's webinar is how to be a house of prayer for all people. We are thrilled to have Shelly Christensen here with us today to lead us in this webinar. And this inclusion learning series will focus on the high holidays, different aspects from different experts. So without stealing any of Shelly's thunder, I'm going to pass it off to her. We are going to have a 40-minute or so presentation by Shelly, followed by a Q&A period.
There we go. Hi. Thanks for being here, everyone. It's just a pleasure to be able to be present and to be able to meet with you this afternoon. Thanks for your time and for all the work that you are all doing. And I also want to thank Rabbi Edie Mencher and Joe Robbins and the Union for Reform Judaism, the Ruderman Family Foundation, and again, all of you who are attending. I want to just start out with something we all know. The high holidays provide the key to opening the doors of our synagogues to welcome and participation. It's this time of year where our sanctuaries are full and people are there reflecting, renewing, accomplishing a lot of things. And during this time, it's especially appropriate to consider what makes us feel that we belong to our community, our synagogue. What brings you to the synagogue for the high holidays? Why do other people come to the synagogue? I think we're there because it fulfills an individual need. People long for connection. They long for community. And each one of us has a list of things that are important to us about being involved in some way. In our own ways, each of us has a sense of belonging to this place and these people. Our days of awe can inspire us to do more, to be aware that there are Jews who do not feel that sense of belonging. My dear friend, the former disability rights advisor for the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, Rabbi Lynn Landsberg, once wrote, in Brachot 34b, the Talmud teaches that a synagogue must be built with windows in the sanctuary. She continues, I believe this is so we can see who is outside and unable to join us. As Jews, we have to maintain mental windows everywhere so that we understand that those whom we refer to as shut-ins are not shut in. They are cruelly shut out of the life that many of us take for granted. As Jews, we're responsible to perform mitzvot, to follow God's commandments, and yet we know there are Jews who are not able to do so. It's not for a lack of will or desire. It's because the doors to the synagogue in Jewish life are entirely closed to them, or they just don't have the opportunities to determine how they would like to participate, just like any of us do. We have to learn to ask people what they want. During the days of awe, we share our responsibility to open those doors to a meaningful and self-directed Jewish life where everyone's gifts, talents, and strengths are valued, and also where one's need for comfort, prayer, learning, and community are satisfied. As Jews, we have that responsibility to one another, the responsibility to empower people with disabilities and mental health conditions to live the kind of Jewish life that they want must belong to each and every one of us. The important thing is to let go of our fears of saying or doing the wrong thing when we are with a person who lives with a disability. We have to understand that inclusion of people with disabilities is a matter of belonging and safe access, not as a matter of expensive renovations to our buildings or separate programs or services. We can and we must Look at each human being as a creation of the Holy One, made B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. Access to God must have no barriers. Many of the people who sit in those pews during the days of awe are not even aware that people with disabilities are a part of or want to be a part of the synagogue life. Well, it's time to enlighten them, because we know awareness changes everything. Awareness has three components. Knowing, number one, that something exists. Knowing that there are people who live with disabilities that aren't participating or don't feel that they belong in the same way and the way that they would like to. That's the first aspect. Feeling, experience, or noticing something is also part of it. Knowing and accepting that people worship in different ways, have different needs, different styles, different sensory needs to participate. That's also part of this. And then knowing and understanding a lot about what is happening in our world around us. And for the people who fill those pews for the high holidays, they need to be aware and know that inclusion is a congregational value and it's a priority. So it's really important that we raise their awareness level and help them understand that including people with disabilities is an important value in the synagogue, and each one of us has a role to play. Without awareness, inclusion could fall off the radar. So later on in this call, I'll share some strategies that you can incorporate to raise awareness. And I really want to just put this out there. What is inclusion? What is it? Back in 2001, 15 years ago, when this inclusion movement, the disability inclusion movement, was just barely getting started, inclusion was defined as the opportunity for people with and without disabilities to participate in Jewish life. In those days, and still in some congregations today, synagogues thought that the absence of people with disabilities in the pews was because there were no Jews with disabilities. Or maybe they just didn't think about it. We know differently. Nearly 20% of the population has some kind of disability or mental health condition, and we as Jews are certainly not exempt from this. We know that disability also spans the life cycle. Some people are born with disabilities, others acquire them, others are diagnosed later in life. Some are age-related, some are genetic. Some people have visible disabilities, whereas other people may have disabilities that are not readily apparent. The stigma that has existed still creates obstacles to full and meaningful participation. So 15 years ago, we had to start somewhere to raise awareness that, yes, there were people with disabilities, many of them, who wanted to be part of synagogue and community life, but didn't even know where to start to express their wishes. They didn't even know where the points of entry were or how to access them. When we look at our individual synagogue histories, we may see that people with disabilities have in some way been served through our synagogues or in our Jewish communities. Oftentimes, these were special programs that were Jewish in content, but kept people separated from others in the community. Or sometimes groups of people with disabilities would sit in our pews for a service here or a program there. Their occasional attendance somehow just a reminder to them how much they were missing out by being a guest and not being a valid congregant. My first year working with synagogues and Jewish agencies in my own community of Minneapolis centered on the concept of moving people with disabilities from invisibility to visibly in. That was the first year of work that we did. Now, over time, the paradigm for inclusion has changed. People with disabilities and those who love them realized that they wanted more than just an occasional visit or a special program. What we were doing was focusing on the disability and what we thought that meant in terms of participation, rather than focusing on what an individual wanted so that they too could be a valued member of the congregation. Now we've begun to think differently than ever before. The word inclusion itself has varied interpretations. To some, it means any program where people with disabilities are the primary participants, but have very little to no opportunity to participate in the life of the synagogue like anyone else. To others, it means that individuals are treated like any other congregant. We support them to participate in any activity that's important to them, and that's person-centered thinking. We have made strides. Our synagogues have accomplished a lot over the last decade to bring the idea of inclusion forward, addressing head-on the absence of people with disabilities. We have gone from invisibility to visibly in, but that's not enough, not when people with disabilities are still not empowered and invited to have the same opportunities as everyone else. We ask ourselves these questions. How is it possible to achieve inclusion when our synagogues struggle to include people who use wheelchairs or who communicate in ways that require us to change how we share information? Are we approaching this conversation with the assumption that one size is going to have to fit everyone who lives with a disability? Have we committed ourselves to attempt to achieve the impossible by setting ourselves up with unrealistic expectations about including everyone? The biggest question we have is, how are we going to fulfill the words of the prophet Isaiah? I will bring them to my holy mount, and I will cause them to rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be acceptable upon my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. It depends, I think, on how we interpret this iconic statement in the book of Isaiah. Our assumptions have always resided in the words, for all people. We assume that in order to open our doors to allow everyone in, we have to do things that cost a lot of money, or change how we do things, or start a special program for those people, or even find out where they are so we can invite them all in. We're focused so much on all people that we lose God's intent for a house of prayer. Isaiah says that God will bring the people to God's holy mount and cause them to rejoice in God's house of prayer, their burnt offerings and their sacrifices acceptable upon God's altar. The synagogue is a place where each person can rejoice, can contribute, and can participate. This is God's definition of inclusion, not ours. And it's time for us, in the month leading up to the Days of Awe in Elul, to expand our thinking about community, participation, and belonging, and what it takes to achieve God's inclusion. Now, earlier, I said that everyone has a role to play, whether it's increasing understanding and knowledge about inclusion or getting involved in the Congregational Inclusion Initiative. We all have a role to play, but let's stop for a moment. And if you have a pen or pencil and paper handy, that's great. If not, you can go ahead and get one, or even use your computer. I'm going to ask you to write 3 things. Take a moment and write down 3 things that are important to you in your Jewish life. Write down 3 things you cannot live without. We'll wait just a moment while you do that. Okay. Choose one of those things. Choose the one that's most important to you. And let's say this. If I were in the room with you, if we were all together in the room, I would go up to you and I would take that away from you. And I would say, I'm sorry, you chose to give this up. You can't live without it. Too bad. You have to now. I know it's important to you, but that's just too bad. And what if I walked up to you and I just took one of those things from you and I didn't ask you which one you wanted to give up? Or what if I took all 3? What if I took something so important to you, never asked you to talk about it, to share it? And what if I said, well, you know what? I know Torah study is important to you, but you're not going to be able to go to Torah study anymore. It's gone. But you can come to a service that we're having for Hanukkah in December. You can come to that one service. we'll let you come to that. This is precisely what we do every time we offer programming for people with disabilities. So when we have special Havdalah services or worship services, every time we decide how people can participate. That's exactly what we're doing. We're taking away what's important. We're not even asking them. And that's why we need to change our mindset about inclusion. We think about disability as something that separates us from them. Disability is not, never has been, and never will be the whole of a person. And when it comes down to it, each one of us shares something really important, our Judaism. And within that, we each have things that are important to us that make us want to belong and be part of a synagogue. So what we're going to do is take a look at what it takes to be a house of prayer for all people, built on what we've been teaching and what you've been doing in your congregations. And then we're going to add a concept that brings us closer to thinking about what's important rather than about the disability. I'm really excited to present this to you. The House of Prayer for All Peoples has two things, structure of inclusion and the spirit of belonging. And it takes both to be a house of prayer for all peoples. We've been devoted to the practical strategies to become more inclusive and welcoming people with disabilities. I call this the structure of inclusion. And as we've seen across the reform movement, it's been well embraced and it's been really effective. We have to organize ourselves to keep inclusion on the front burner of congregational concerns. And we need to continuously raise awareness and educate everyone in our community. We need lay and professional leaders to shepherd how we do this. The structure of inclusion creates and implements all the tangible things we do, starting an inclusion committee, assessing how the congregation is supporting people with disabilities, creating a vision or a roadmap or a work plan, adding language that invites people to come in, that requests accommodations, arranging sign language interpreters, inviting people with disabilities to participate in services, planning meaningful programs during Jewish Disability Awareness and Inclusion Month in February, and making sure that we're continuously evaluating and improving upon the deliberate actions that promote inclusion. The spirit of belonging. Now, the High Holy Days give us the opportunity to make inclusion a priority by incorporating it throughout. So let's look at how the structure of inclusion plays out. The spirit of belonging plays out when we ask people what's important to you and how can we make sure that's part of your involvement. To help explain this, I've broken it down into distinct areas. So the structure of inclusion is organization-centered culture change. And that's where the synagogue assumes the responsibility for internal changes through an intentional process. And you can read right here some of those things, which I just discussed. But I want you to think about some of the things for the days of awe and for the beginning of the new year. Think about if your congregation has the new Mishkan HaNefesh, the new Machzor. Did you know it's available in large print? And it's also available on Amazon for Kindles. By the way, there's a great discussion on the tent about whether or not people can use or should use e-readers in services. And I urge you to go to the tent if you can and look at the discussion there. It's really great. People are wrestling with that. Schedule a time with them to come in and do a walkthrough, kind of an orientation. Have them come into the sanctuary, see where they'd like to sit, perhaps find a place. We're really trying to help people feel comfortable. If somebody, have them go on the bima, have them hold the Torah, show them the Torah scroll, have them stand at the reading desk and look out, or have them be by the reading desk. Just have people get comfortable. Some people are familiar with the ritual items, other ones aren't. And so this is a really good way to help people feel comfortable when they come in that very first time. Now, I want to also talk about, in terms of raising awareness and the spirit of belonging, the parshas that we read on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur form the bookends of the Torah. Bereshit for Rosh Hashanah, in the beginning, right? And also, that is the parsha that talks about B'Tselem Elohim. So if you're having your Torah readers give a Devar Torah, or if it's integrated into a sermon, what a great way to use the text and to build on the text in terms of what your congregation is engaged in. The other parsha, Nitzavim, that we read on Yom Kippur, where we are all gathered together. Everyone is gathered together to conclude the Brit with God. Everyone is there, those who were present, physically present, and those who weren't. And Nitzavim goes on to say that the Torah is accessible to everyone. It's not something where we have to go up to the sky and get it, or go down below the ocean and get it. It's there in our hearts and our minds. It's part of who we are. And I think that that's a really important reminder for belonging. It needs our attention. It needs us to think about these things. So you have all these opportunities, and there are many things you can do to incorporate the spirit of belonging. One more thing that you could do is, if you have a congregational break fast, make sure that you label all the foods. And many of us do that during the year, and it's a great time to do that now. And while you're doing some of these things for the holidays, these are all practices you can use in the beginning of the year. Something I want you to think about, and I've been working with this concept of structure and spirit for a long time, and trying to figure out exactly what that meant to the work that we're all doing in our congregations. And I came to the conclusion that sometimes we focus so much on the structure of inclusion, which is really important. We need that. We often find ourselves distracted from why we do this in the first place. And that's where we turn to the other part of Isaiah's statement. This is where sometimes we can forget the very people that we seek to include, and are drawn to the synagogue and the community for the same reasons most of us are. To rejoice, to worship, to be part of the community. People with disabilities are not the congregational mitzvah project, so the rest of us feel we've done something worthy to help them. People with disabilities should have the opportunities to perform mitzvot like any of us. And this is the spirit of belonging. This is what it looks like. I'd like to introduce my friend Sharon Pillay and Rabbi Norman Cohen, Rabbi Emeritus of Bet Shalom Congregation. And this photo was taken at a Hanukkah service. Everybody's involved. Sharon is very active. She's on the board of the congregation, and she's very, very involved. She belongs. And she's the person who taught me about belonging and how important it is. Belonging is the reason we embarked on this journey of inclusion in the first place. Belonging is a human need, and there's no greater opportunity to belong than in the Jewish community. Belonging is about relationships. It's about personal connections, about respecting and being respected, about valuing and being valued. And as the great faith community inclusion expert Ginny Thornburg once said, there should be no barriers to God's love. What I'm going to do now is share a video that is a great example of how structure and spirit are reflected in one congregation's journey. And when we're done with the video, we'll be taking comments, questions, answers, I guess, Q&A. So without further ado, let's meet the structure of inclusion married to the spirit of belonging in this video in one congregation.
The rabbi who suggested the creation story as the most important teaching gets everyone else's agreement. Because, he says, the most important teaching is that God created the human being in God's image. And he said that the reason this is the most important teaching is that if we regard every other human being as created in the divine image, as we like to picture ourselves, then everything else will follow.
One of the most famous quotes from the prophets in American Judaism is from the prophet Isaiah, who said that my house will be a house for all peoples. And knowing what I know about the folks that were involved in thinking about this building and creating this building, is that that's what they wanted. They wanted this to be a house that would be a house for all people.
Here at Bet Shalom, there was never that idea of doing something for someone. And I think sometimes when we do that, we relegate people. The ultimate way that people feel is that they're a mitzvah project. We have to take care of them. And nothing could be really further from the truth. People just want to be part of the Jewish community.
My name is Matthew Hurwitz, and my son Joseph is in 4th grade, and he goes to temple at Bet Shalom. From day one, Rabbi Cohen and Rabbi Lockett and Rabbi Crimmings especially have gone out of their way to say, everybody's welcome. We can make whatever accommodations are necessary. This isn't our first child with special needs, and most certainly won't be our last, and they will find ways to accommodate. They've been really great.
When he first came, you could tell he was a little nervous because, first of all, this was a brand new experience for him, being here at Bet Shalom. And right away, Leah was with him from day one. And I just remember, the first time they met in the social hall we had about 100, 150 kids in there. And he came in and Leah was sitting at the table to greet him. And from that day on, the very first thing he does when he comes is he asks, where's Leah?
One thing that I love about Joey is that he loves Judaism so much. He has really taken a liking to it, and he, doesn't have the same inhibitions that other people might, so he's not afraid to share that. So it's really fun to sit by him in services. He loves reading Torah. It's his favorite thing. And he loves praying, and he loves God, and he just loves everything about Judaism.
He has a sense of community here that I don't think he really understands how important it is to him now, but I think he feels that he has a place that he belongs and that welcomes him, and that not only entertains but embraces his differences. And I think that's going to continue to be important to him as he grows up.
Yeah, it's a super Jewish thing. I think it's so important in Judaism to include everyone and see that everybody has something to offer and something to share.
An incredible feeling for me, because one of the worst feelings in the world is when you have a child with special needs and you watch them kind of get left behind because they have different needs and not everybody can meet them. And Joey's capable of a lot, but sometimes he needs a little help, and he gets that here.
And it was only after we moved into the building and we've been here for a while that you start to see some of the things that could be better, see some of the things that could make a real difference for people. It was brought to our attention that our mezuzahs, the mezuzot that are on our doors, were too high for some people to reach. It's, of course, a Jewish custom to take note of the mezuzah when you pass through an entrance to a building. And our mezuzahs were too high for people who are in wheelchairs, too high for many children to access. And so we decided that in the true nature of Reform Judaism, we could take a look at that custom and think about whether or not the mezuzah could be moved. If it could be moved a little lower, and perhaps think of the result as opposed to the rule. And so from that very first moment of entering the space, they feel included in a way they might not have been otherwise. It gives us a chance to educate. It gives us a chance to talk about the value of inclusion. It gives us a chance to constantly rethink how we reach people and perhaps address the fact that through the things we've always done, we may really be missing an opportunity to welcome somebody into our community.
inclusion isn't just about participating in services in the sanctuary. It's about being part of the congregation. It's in the classroom, the boardroom, any place that there is an activity for a synagogue. It should never be closed because somebody has a disability.
I go to study about every week. But I am most people are talking people, and we both come together for the same reasons, so it makes me feel part of the synagogue.
That this sanctuary is just one of the things about this building that tells us who we are and reminds us of who we are. It reminds us of the challenges that we still need to overcome. Because as much as this building was built with disabilities in mind and inclusion in mind, we're still finding things that stand in the way. But this sanctuary has no ramp. And you might say, why would we not build a ramp? Well, the fact is the sanctuary floor itself is a ramp. So no matter who goes up to the bima, and everyone in our congregation has an opportunity to go to the bima, we all go up the same way. And as we're walking forward, as we reach the part that inclines, our steps get higher. And we can feel the ascension, which in Hebrew is called aliyah. And we make aliyah, we literally go up. And everyone goes up the same way.
It's all about the strengths that we all have, the gifts that we all have. They're about the blessings that we bring to our community. So I think it helps people really think about what we're talking about, what this idea of inclusion really is, and what it means to be genuine and authentic in supporting people with disabilities so that they have the kind of quality of Jewish life that they want.
And if we continue to grow and always do better than we did before, then I think we truly are accomplishing this part of our mission, which is to be that house for all people.
If we look into a person's eyes and see the spark of the divine, we won't have to be told how to treat that person. We'll know how to treat that person with dignity and respect. And it doesn't say some people are created in the divine image. It says that each and every human being is created in the divine image.
And there we have it. We'll take some time for questions and answers. I just wanted to let you know if you'd like to contact me. This is my contact information, Shelly@inclusioninnovations.com. You can visit my website at inclusioninnovations.com. And this year, as I've done for several years now, you can find the High Holiday Inclusive Congregation Guide that goes over some of the things we talked about today and has other things too. And you'll also see a bit of a preview for Jewish Disability Awareness and Inclusion Month. Again, that's in February. And we have already begun promoting the reading program for JDAME Reads, with 2 wonderful, wonderful books. And you can find those also on my website. So I will stop sharing this and we can start talking, chatting.
All right. Hi, everybody. First of all, thank you so much to Shelly for the wonderful presentation. We have time now, as Shelly mentioned, for Q&A. Shelly, what we're going to do is any questions that come in should go to both of us, and I'll help direct them to you. We have one question that came in from Joshua Ackman. Joshua's question is whether this video and PowerPoint will be available for download after the session. Joshua is starting a position on his staff designed to assist special needs families, and he would love to show the video to the staff member. And so the answer is definitely, Joshua. All of the information from this webinar, including the webinar itself, and accompanying resources will be on the Disabilities Inclusion Learning Center next week. The Learning Center is located at disabilitiesinclusion.org, and we'll send a follow-up email to this webinar with all of that information once it's live. So I'm going to hand things back over to Shelly now, and please let us know any questions that you have. Shelly, are you able to see the Q&A button at the bottom? Or is that just... Okay, so if you click on that, you should be able to see the questions coming in. It looks like we have a new one from Nancy.
Okay, and Nancy, thanks for your question, and Joshua, thank you for your question, and wishing you all the very best with your position. You can certainly contact me at any time if you have any questions or just want to go through some things that you're concerned about. Anyway, so Nancy Basov asked, you mentioned the language not to use and the R word. What's the best source to keep up on the progression of understanding and sensitivity for the most comprehensive inclusion of abilities and disabilities? It is such a good question, Nancy, and it's one that we think about all the time. I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to give you kind of my understanding of this and my take on this, and that simply is my training and my background is in the disability world and the Jewish world. But I've always, I guess what really resonated with me is to use the term disability, not use the term special needs or, any kind of euphemistic language. The reason for that is because disability is the preferred term currently used by the disability community. It allows us to just call it what it is, disability. So person with disability, always the person first language. I'm going to give a caveat to that too in just a moment. So it's the other, when we talk about the R word, which, sorry, has pretty much been banished from a lot of vocabulary now. In fact, I'll just show you my pen that I've had for a long time. So that's, don't use the R word. The R word, oops, sorry. There's certain language that is outdated. And there are many words used to describe people with disabilities that we just don't use anymore. One of those words is handicapped. Oh, he's handicapped. Or even the visual for accessibility has kind of been nicknamed, it's handicap parking. We can say it's accessible parking, or it's an accessible restroom, things like that. So we don't use that language anymore. Kathy Snow, her name is Kathy Snow, Kathie Snow. You can Google her. She has a website called Disability is Natural. And I like to go to her website. She kind of keeps me focused on person first language and language not to use. The New Normal, which is a blog from the Jewish News in New York. There's a writer named Sharon Shapiro Lax, and Sharon Sharon's a disability rights advocate, and she has a program called Yad HaChazaka in New York. She's written extensively on the use of language, and I love what she's written, and she makes a lot of sense and explaining what language to use and what language really is euphemistic and so on. So again, encourage you, and I can send you those links too. We can send those links maybe, Joe, in the email that we send out, so people can access those different things. I'm going to say one more thing about language. Okay, we talk about person first language, but there's such a thing called identity first language, and this is why one size doesn't fit all, and that's why houses of prayer have many individuals to support or different needs to meet. But identity first language is used in a lot of people in the autistic community. So putting the identity before the personhood. And the reason for that is that individuals, some people, identify very closely to, they identify very closely as having a particular disability. You can find that in the deaf community as well. And so I can't say, don't use this, use this. And I'm not going to. I think the best thing to do, as I mentioned, use somebody's name, call somebody by their name, don't identify them as the Down syndrome kid or anything like that. Just say, Pete, the child, that boy over there, his name is Pete. Use the name. It's really, I think, the best advice I can give you. And I will also try to find something about identity first language as well. I hope that answers your question. Gabby Kaplan-Mayer, who is the New Normal editor. It's called the New Normal Blogging Disability. Just posted the link to the New Normal, and they put all their stories on Facebook. So do this, go to Facebook and search for the New Normal Blogging Disability. It's all one word. And everything gets posted there. And you can like it and you can share it. So it's great. And we'll send that information out.
Yeah, and also when we post this webinar on the Learning Center, we'll include all the resources mentioned and referenced here. So it will be, we'll send you the one link to the webinar, and when you follow that link, you'll have all of these great resources that Shelly has mentioned throughout her talk, including her PowerPoint, as well as the ones that have come up now during the Q&A period.
Great. Another question from Joshua Ackman. Are you able to assist us in finding different grants we can apply for designed positions and accessible remodeling? We are trying to build a real community here, but as we all know, funding is always an issue. Yes, funding is always an issue, always, as it is for many things. There are a couple things that I think you can do, and depending on where you live, where your community is, you can sometimes go to your state. Every state has a disabilities services office. They may know of some grants within your state. I know in my state of Minnesota, there is nothing. There are no grants available for, and being a faith community too, there may not be public funding for anything like that. But you never know. And that's the big thing. You never know until you ask. Several different situations I've encountered. First of all, inclusion is really a mindset, and it's important. That's why we talk about raising awareness, because we really have to weave this into the entire congregation. And so when we do things that don't require money and we kind of publicize them, or we weave them into things like accommodation statements. That tells the congregation, inclusion is a really important value. Accessible remodeling. And, there are plenty of architectural firms that deal with the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and the regulations that are within the ADA. Although faith communities, for the most part, are not covered by the ADA, not covered under the ADA, the ADA is a really important, it's a mandate. We call it, in fact, Rabbi Lynn Landsberg, who I know is also on the call right now, we call that a moral mandate, because it gives us a way of using those tried and true accommodations that really do work for buildings and construction. So when you're looking at that, or if you're doing a capital campaign for your congregation to remodel, make sure that accessibility is part of that. Now, in some instances, and I can think of several different congregations that felt that they really, they needed to put a ramp in, for example, to their bima. And what they did was they just started talking about it. They started posting it in the bulletin that that's what they wanted to do. And really what happened is that several congregants were approached them and said, we want to help fund this. And so all of a sudden they had some funding. It was, composite of different donors in the congregation. And interestingly enough, and I'm going to tell you this story because it's so powerful, it's so important. So this congregation had the funding for the ramp to the bima. And the funder said, one of the funders said, you know what, I'm happy to do this. I'm excited to do this, but I'm going to tell you something. When I drop my wife off and she uses a wheelchair, I cannot tell you how long we have to wait for somebody to open the door. Yes, the door, the access is there, but there are no automatic door openers. So he said, if you can find someone to fund automatic door openers, making it easier for people to get in the building, to get to the bima, then I'm in. But until then, I'm not putting 1 cent toward this. And it was a challenge. And actually, the inclusion committee of this particular congregation was just stymied. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And actually what they did is they did what they did before. They put it out to the congregation. And eventually, it took some time, but they found someone who was willing to fund the automatic door openers. So don't give up. Don't give up. And I like to use this, the analogy of improvisation, because a lot of the things that we do, we try them. And if they don't work, we try something else. We're constantly improvising and finding ways to make things happen. And that's a really important thing to think about, because I can share with you, and a lot of people who are involved in our work can share with you things that have worked for them. But I'll tell you, the best thing of all is when we talk through issues and we try and figure things out together, and we try and make things work. So again, improvisation is really important in all of this work. So I want to know if there's any other questions, or if there's anything that you want answered that hasn't been asked or answered yet in the course of the conversation. And I guess one of my questions to you is, I'm just compelled by the e-reader version of Mishkan HaNefesh. I love this whole conversation about it. How do you feel about e-readers during the sacred time of our year, this most reflective time of our year? How do you feel about somebody having their e-reader open and swiping back and forth? And is this something that, is in your congregation? Is this a discussion that you've had, or might you have that?
If anybody has an answer about the e-readers or any other questions, feel free to type them in the chat box. I see we have another question from Joshua Ackman. Thank you so much, Joshua. So I will hand it back over to Shelly so she can answer that. But like I said, if you have any more questions or comments, feel free to use the Q&A box and also the chat box to respond to anything that you've heard today. All right, thank you for the questions so far, and Shelly, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, it's Joshua Ackman. Hi. With one more question. Are there any good sources for us to find Jewish text, much like the biblical verses you used earlier, to use with children? And yes, there are. I'm going to refer you to a couple places. And if I forget any, I'm sure my colleagues who are on the call will help me remember as well. First of all, I think that, first of all, if you talk about this, if you start talking about this and bring it up with your educator, your preschool director, the teachers, they're already using text in there. And I think that a lot of the text that we use, a lot of the concepts that we use in teaching our children about Torah, a lot of that text can be seen under that lens of inclusion, of where we all belong, where we're all a part of something. I think that also you can, there are some great children's books. If you go to PJ Library, there have been some really, really good books that raise awareness about disability, and just a lot of different really great books that we've used actually for Jewish Disability Awareness and Inclusion Month as well to start teaching about disability. So there's some really great books there. Lisa Friedman, thank you, Lynn. Lisa Friedman, who is a Reformed Jewish educator and director of Temple Bethel, I believe is Temple Bethel I'm going to get the community wrong, so I'm not even going to try, in New Jersey. She writes a blog, and we'll include that also in the information. You can reach out to Lisa or read the blog. There's some, she talks about this a lot too. She talks about inclusion as well. As far as text, some of the text I just can, share with you some of the things that I use, that I've used with children and teens and adults, is the, of course, the mother of all, I'm going to call it the mother of all text, which is Moses, and Moses, who had a speech disability, and God calling upon Moses to lead the Israelites, lead the Jewish people out of Egypt, out of slavery, and Moses being the reluctant leader, saying, sorry, I can't do it, no can do, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but saying, I've got a speech thing going, I've got a speech disorder, I can't possibly do it, and God saying to Moses, look, who do you think made you this way? I did. And God looked at Moses, and he saw the qualities. We talked about strengths and gifts, and Moses had those. And we can see Moses was the greatest leader of all. And the other thing that God did was say to Moses, you know what? I know this part is difficult for you, but let's give you an accommodation. We're going to put your brother Aaron is going to speak for you. You tell him what to say, he will speak for you. And it was, and also Moses acted as God's spokesperson as well. But if we think about that, there's a lot of people in the Torah who had some kind of disability, who were great leaders with whom we wouldn't be here. So take a visit through the Torah. Also, a trip through the Torah, and what better time to start than Simchat Torah, coming up. You can get the whole year from Genesis to Deuteronomy and really learn a lot of great things there too. So, any other questions?
All right. Well, looks like that is everything for today. So I want to take a minute and thank all of you so much for joining us for this first call in the URJ-Ruderman High Holidays Inclusion Learning Series. It was great to have you here. And a huge thank you to Shelly Christensen for her expertise as always and for kicking us off, starting us on the right foot as we approach the high holiday season and look to make the high holidays inclusive for everyone inside and outside of our communities and hopefully bring everyone into our communities. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Shelly. Until then, we hope everyone has a great weekend. Thank
Shana
you.
Tova.
Shana Tova, definitely. Thank you all.